Having lived in Singapore, albeit for a short amount of time, I thought it'd be fun to chat about their politics. Obviously, this is all my own opinions, and I wouldn't be able to make any criticisms if I was living in the country. And I'm also not going to pretend to be an expert. But despite their flaws, Singapore is one of my favourite places in the world. I'll start with my experience in Singapore, go into the history, and then finally the politics. Singapore is an absolutely beautiful country. It's clean, it's safe, and it's fucking hot. The first time I went to Singapore, I was wearing a suit. Why? Because I'm a fucking idiot. When I walked out of the airport in 35-degree heat with 90% humidity, it's like getting punched in the face. Singapore is tiny, like 720 square kilometres or something ridiculously small, but they have a population of 5.6 million. I can't even begin to explain how much money there is in Singapore. I mean, there are as many Rolex shops as there are McDonald's. Ferraris and Lamborghinis are absolutely everywhere, especially on Orchard Road, where every man and his dog goes to show off. And those cars are incredibly more expensive over there. Like our Mazda 3, which is about 30 grand in Australia, cost about 130 grand over there. And don't even get me started on how much the condo cost. If you lived on Sentosa Island, then you, sir, are fucking rich. And don't even get me started on the tax. Like, it's fucking amazing. It's so low, you'd almost let the IRAS keep the change from your tax bill. There's no minimum wage, massively free markets. It's basically a business owner's wet dream. Disneyland with a death sentence, I believe it's also known. Oh, and drugs are surprisingly easy to get, considering that it's a country that has a death penalty for importing even small amounts of drugs. So I've heard. Yes, I've heard. Also, what's super interesting is that Singapore has one of the highest income inequalities in the world, but a lot of that money goes into healthcare, education, housing, etc. So even if you're poor as fuck, you won't be left on the streets to die. So it's like everything that Bernie Sanders was fighting against that's achieved everything that Bernie Sanders was fighting for, with the exception of income inequality, obviously. So it's like the weirdest mix of free market capitalism and socialism that you will ever see. Now let's go into the history, as I think it's important before we go into the politics. Because the story of Lee Kuan Yew is a really interesting one. This is a guy who took a fishing village from a third world country to a first world economic powerhouse in 50 years. Alright, so to cut a very, very long story short, Singapore used to be under Malaysian rule after the British fucked off, and the country was basically just a fishing village. Then in 1965, the Malaysian government basically told Singapore to fuck off and to be its own country. Then Lee Kuan Yew became Singapore's first Prime Minister under the People's Action Party, or the PAP, and the PAP has been ruling the country ever since. Lee Kuan Yew was a very, very intelligent man. He was a very good leader, he was a massive fan of free markets, incredibly pragmatic, and authoritarian as fuck. As authoritarian as he may be, I don't think he's actually given out any complimentary helicopter rides. In Singapore, the libel laws regarding slander and defamation are very strict. These laws allowed Lee Kuan Yew and his PAP to effectively intimidate political opposition. The most well-known example was several lawsuits initiated by Lee Kuan Yew against opposition politician, now I'm going to butcher this name, but J.B. Jeyaretnam of the Workers' Party. He was sued for slander for stating that a senior PAP official was engaging in corruption. Later, he was sued again, successfully, for saying that certain government officials were stooges of Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP. These lawsuits cost Jeyaretnam hundreds of thousands of dollars and resulted in his removal from Parliament twice. Lee Kuan Yew has also sued other organisations, including Bloomberg, for defamation relating to an article that asserted the government was engaging in nepotism. An environment where criticism of the ruling party and its leader is perilous reduces the effectiveness and openness of political debate, and is for sure illiberal by definition. This uniquely Singaporean brand of authoritarianism outright avoids repressive tactics in favour of using the courts to intimidate those who make claims about the ruling party that they can't back up. Whether those assertions of corruption were true or not, we just don't know. There are also other limits on free speech, including the right to protest being limited, as well as strict hate speech laws. Amos Yee, who is worthy of a separate video, is a Singaporean free speech advocate who made videos that were extremely critical of Lee Kuan Yew and Islam. He did outrageous things like dry hump the Quran in his bed on video, intentionally running afoul of rules banning offensive speech against religious groups, meant to, and I quote, maintain social harmony. He was jailed for free speech offences twice, and it is thought that he did so to draw attention to the limitations on free speech in Singapore. That said, it is worth pointing out that had he been more circumspect and not engaged in the more outrageous antics, it is very likely the authorities would have left him alone. Regardless of how you see Lee Kuan Yew, you have to give the man credit. He took Singapore from a third world country to being the richest country in the world in a single generation. I think he's possibly the only person who has ever achieved this. Singapore has a GDP of nearly 308 billion, and that's in a country that's effectively the size of Greater Brisbane, which makes it one of the highest per capita GDPs in terms of purchasing power parity, has 2% unemployment and a trade surplus of nearly 100 billion. It's also one of the least corrupt countries in the world, and has multiple investment companies that invest in Singaporean companies to make extra cash. So when it comes to making money, Singapore knows what the fuck is up. I don't want to speak on behalf of Singaporean nationals, but it at least appeared that Lee Kuan Yew was loved by the people. His death was almost like when Princess Diana passed away. Now, Singapore is technically not a single-party system, and because the rule of law is so highly regarded and the corruption is almost non-existent, there is a chance another party could take power if they won enough electoral divisions, but time will tell if that ever happens. Anyway, lots of stupid laws, great economy, fun as fuck to live there, so yeah, miss your singers. So until next time, cheers!